The night air over Harlem in the early 1960s held 1,000 sounds at once. Saxophones spilling from basement clubs, buses sighing at street corners, the steady rhythm of footsteps on sidewalks still warm from the day's sun. Among the crowd moved a young man named Leroy, but already the name Nicky had begun to stick. He walked quickly but never hurried, his gaze taking in every doorway, every flicker of neon, every chance meeting. He wasn't rich, not yet, but he had a presence that made people turn their heads, a mix of calm and alertness that suggested he knew something they didn't. He grew up only a few blocks away, in apartments where the paint peeled and neighbors kept their hopes small to avoid disappointment. From an early age, he understood that the official rules of the city rarely protected kids like him. Yet he also saw, even as a teenager, that Harlem was a stage as well as a maze. There were men who played it right, barbers, shopkeepers, musicians, and they carved out respectable lives. But there were also men who moved differently, who seemed to float above the noise, dressed in sharp suits and stepping out of shiny cars. To a boy with restless ambition, those figures were like constellations, hints of another kind of life. By his late teens, Nicky had already been through the reformatories and small-time hustles that taught hard lessons without wiping out his hope. He wasn't interested in quick chaos. What drew him was order. The idea that even in the shadows there could be a system, rules, and a plan. He watched older operators handle disputes quietly, pay people on time, and make things run. That, he thought, was real power. Not shouting, but structuring. Not flashing, but arranging. Even then, he was studying, absorbing, learning what not to do as much as what to do. He began spending nights in clubs where music and conversation blended into a single hum. Jazz musicians, off-duty cops, postal clerks, and hustlers all shared the same air, and Nicky listened. He learned who could be trusted, who was bluffing, who owed whom. He was careful with his words and generous with small favors. A drink here, an introduction there. By 20, he already had a reputation for keeping his cool. People started coming to him with minor problems. He solved them quietly, building a network not of fear but of obligation. At the same time, Harlem itself was on the edge of change. New construction projects, shifting demographics, and a rising tide of both opportunity and frustration gave the neighborhood a volatile energy. Nicky sensed that the old informal hierarchies were crumbling, and that new ones could be built in their place. He imagined a future where the chaos of street hustles could be replaced by something almost corporate, where deals were honored and disputes settled without noise. It was a bold vision for a young man with no formal education but a keen sense of organization. His friends noticed that he always dressed a little better than his means allowed. Crisp shirts, polished shoes, subtle but stylish ties. It wasn't vanity. It was a signal. If you want people to respect your words, he once told a friend, make sure they respect your presence first. This philosophy extended beyond clothes. He was punctual, kept notes, and remembered details about people's families. In an environment where many were guided by impulse, Nicky was guided by intention. By the mid-1960s, his world had expanded beyond a few blocks. He was known in bars uptown, and even in certain downtown circles as someone reliable, discreet, and ambitious. He still lived modestly, but he thought constantly about scale. How to take the small, disorganized trades that dotted Harlem and knit them into something steady and controlled. He admired businessmen like Motown's Berry Gordy, who turned raw neighborhood talent into a polished brand. Why, he wondered, couldn't someone do the same with the under-the-table economy swirling around him? That thought stayed with him like a secret melody. When he walked through the bustling streets, he wasn't just seeing what was, he was seeing what could be. Networks instead of chaos, councils instead of crews, rules instead of street corner improvisation. He didn't yet know the full shape of the future, but he could feel its outline pressing against his imagination. Each night, as he lay in his small apartment listening to the city's distant horns and laughter, he thought about how to build something that would last. Those who met him then would later say there was a quiet intensity in his eyes. as if he were already rehearsing for a role no one else could see. They didn't know it, but the seeds of Mr. Untouchable were already sprouting in that young man's mind. A boy from Harlem who wanted not just success, but structure. Not just money, but mastery over a world that seemed to live by no rules at all. By the late 1960s, the energy of Harlem was electric. Soul music spilled from record shops, corner barbers debated politics and sports, and new fashions swept the avenues. In that swirl of color and sound, Nicky Barnes was no longer just a face in the crowd. He had become a man people whispered about, a young operator with a gift for organization and a reputation for keeping his word. He didn't flash wealth he didn't yet have. He projected calm competence. People who dealt with him left feeling they had spoken with someone who could see 3 moves ahead. He spent his evenings not in chaos but in planning. His notebooks were filled with lists of contacts, notes on who was reliable, who had access to supplies, who was good at moving money quietly. He also paid close attention to the legal world. New laws, new sentencing guidelines, new political campaigns. He tracked them all. If you don't understand the rules of the game, he told a friend, you're not playing, you're drifting. For a man still in his 20s, it was an unusually disciplined way to think. Nicky's idea was simple but bold. Create a network that behaved like a legitimate business. Instead of dozens of small rival street crews undercutting one another, he imagined a council that coordinated prices, supply, and discipline. In his mind, it was almost like a union or a corporation. Less noise, fewer disputes, better profits. This wasn't about grandstanding. It was about control and predictability. He began floating the idea quietly to trusted contacts, gauging their reactions. Some laughed it off. Others listened with growing interest. At the same time, he cultivated a public persona that mixed style with restraint. His suits were impeccably tailored, but not garish. His cars clean, but not ostentatious. He wanted to be seen as successful, but not reckless. He invested in small, legitimate businesses, a dry cleaner, a club, a car service, partly to diversify his income and partly to give himself a veneer of respectability. In a community used to sudden rises and falls, he looked like a man building something steady. Harlem in those years was also seeing a surge of activism and cultural pride. Nicky paid attention to that too. He contributed quietly to community events, sponsored uniforms for a youth basketball team, and made sure his public image included gestures of generosity. He understood that goodwill was another kind of protection. People who felt you were on their side were less likely to turn against you, and a community that saw you as a benefactor was a shield against easy vilification. Behind the scenes, though, he was tightening the screws of organization. Meetings were held at odd hours in neutral locations. Rules were laid down. Punctuality, discretion, no unnecessary violence. He insisted on clean record-keeping and punctual payments. Those who complied found themselves rewarded. Those who didn't were quietly eased out. "We're running a business, not a circus," he would say. This approach set him apart from other young hustlers of his generation. It also drew attention, both the kind he wanted and the kind he didn't. Because in the shadows, law enforcement was changing too. Federal agencies had begun coordinating more, sharing intelligence across jurisdictions. New surveillance techniques made old habits riskier. Nicky understood that visibility was dangerous. He developed layers of intermediaries so that his name rarely appeared in direct transactions. He learned to think like a chess player, always imagining what the other side might be doing. The only way to stay untouchable, he told one associate, is to move like smoke. Be there, but don't leave fingerprints. Evenings often found him in his office above a small storefront, the city's hum drifting through the window. He would pour himself a soda, loosen his tie, and study his notes. He wasn't interested in a quick run of luck. He wanted a system that could last. He imagined himself not as a street figure, but as a chairman, guiding a complex enterprise with multiple moving parts. In a neighborhood where chaos had long been the norm, the idea of order felt almost revolutionary. Yet he never forgot where he came from. He visited his old block, slipped money to families in need, kept up relationships with childhood friends. This grounded him and also reminded him of the stakes. He knew that behind the glamour of Harlem nightlife were still cramped apartments, overdue bills, and kids trying to find a path out. Part of him believed that by imposing order on the underground economy, he was also reducing the random harm it caused. Whether that was true or not, it helped him justify his course. By the dawn of the 1970s, the outlines of his council were forming. Trusted lieutenants managed day-to-day operations. Couriers moved messages instead of phones. Profits were reinvested into legitimate fronts. From the outside, it looked like a sudden rise. From the inside, it was the result of years of planning. Nicky Barnes, once a restless boy scanning the streets for opportunity, had become the architect of a system. And as he sat back in his chair one evening, listening to the low rumble of traffic on 7th Avenue, he allowed himself a rare smile. The vision he'd nurtured in silence was beginning to take shape. By the early 1970s, Harlem felt like a living stage, and Nicky Barnes was moving his pieces like a seasoned director. The council he'd been imagining was no longer just an idea. It was a functioning network. He had carefully chosen a handful of men who had both credibility on the streets and the discipline to follow his rules. They weren't just subordinates. They were partners in a new kind of enterprise. Together they met in apartments, diners, or rented hotel rooms, never in the same place twice, never without lookouts. Around the table, Nicky was calm but firm, explaining policies the way a corporate executive might outline quarterly goals. He introduced concepts that sounded almost out of place in that world: profit sharing, dispute resolution, a ban on unnecessary feuds. "We win when we're stable," he'd say. "Chaos is bad for business." Slowly, the men began to internalize his vision. Street corner disputes dropped, supplies were standardized, profits went up. And because Nicky insisted on a kind of internal code of conduct, word spread that dealing with the council was less dangerous than dealing with freelancers. He was turning a loose trade into something resembling an industry. On the surface, he maintained his careful public image. He expanded his holdings in legitimate businesses, a clothing boutique, a small trucking company, even a share in a Harlem nightclub known for live jazz. Reporters covering Harlem nightlife started mentioning his name alongside club owners and promoters, rather than only street figures. In photos, he looked like a businessman with an impeccable sense of style, his suits a mix of bold colors and precise tailoring. This was exactly what he wanted, to seem less like an outlaw and more like an icon of success. He also became more deliberate in his community presence. He sponsored scholarships, supported a local arts program, and turned up at charity events. At one such event, a local newspaper snapped a photo of him shaking hands with a city official. The caption called him a Harlem entrepreneur. Nicky clipped the article and put it in a folder on his desk. It was a small but telling sign of how far he'd come from being just another name in a police file. Behind the scenes, though, he never stopped thinking about risk. He rotated his cars, changed phone numbers often, and trained his lieutenants to do the same. He limited his direct exposure to the product itself, dealing instead in information, planning, and finances. He even hired a lawyer on retainer not just for emergencies, but to keep him up to date on new legal tactics being used by prosecutors. "Know what they know," he would say, "and stay one step ahead." The council's influence also began to extend beyond Harlem. Nicky negotiated arrangements with suppliers and middlemen in other cities, building a kind of informal franchise. He didn't try to control everything directly. Instead, he created standards and expected them to be followed. This decentralized model made it harder for law enforcement to pin him down. Agents might catch a courier or a low-level operative, but they rarely found a direct link back to him. It was, for its time, a remarkably sophisticated setup. Yet with success came new challenges. Some outsiders resented the council's growing power. Independent operators who refused to join sometimes tried to undercut prices or bypass Nicky's network. Rather than responding with public violence, Nicky preferred negotiation or strategic pressure, cut off supply lines, offer incentives, absorb rivals quietly. It wasn't always possible, but his preference for order over spectacle gave him a reputation as a strategist rather than a brawler. The media began to notice him more. A glossy magazine ran a feature on Harlem's New Faces of Power and included a short profile of Nicky Barnes without naming the council explicitly. The photograph showed him leaning against a sleek car, sunglasses on, a subtle smile hinting at confidence. He looked less like a fugitive and more like a celebrity. For young men in Harlem, he became a symbol. Controversial, yes, but also aspirational. The idea that someone from their streets could build an empire of discipline and style was intoxicating. Privately, Nicky wrestled with what that image meant. He had started out wanting stability and control, but now he was edging into the territory of myth. People he didn't know began approaching him with proposals, gifts, or requests. He understood that attention was a double-edged sword. The higher you rise, he told a confidant one night, the clearer a target you become. It was a truth he couldn't ignore, so he doubled down on discretion. Meetings grew even more secretive, communications more layered. He began to think about succession, how to keep the network running if he were suddenly removed. He wrote down procedures, trained lieutenants, and tried to instill a culture of discipline. He wanted the council to be an institution, not a personality cult. Whether that was realistic in such an unpredictable environment was another question entirely. As the decade progressed, his life became a study in contrasts. By day, he might be at a legitimate business opening, smiling for cameras, shaking hands. By night, he might be in a dimly lit apartment, poring over ledgers, discussing supply routes, planning contingencies. He lived with a constant low-grade tension, aware that any mistake could unravel everything. And yet, sitting in his leather chair in his office late at night, listening to a jazz record spin softly, he felt a sense of accomplishment. He had taken a chaotic scene and turned it into something resembling order. For a boy from the streets of Harlem, that was no small thing. By the mid-1970s, Nicky Barnes was living in two completely different worlds. One was public and carefully staged, the dapper businessman stepping out of a chauffeur-driven car, a flash of silk lining as he moved, a handshake here, a smile there. The other was quiet, secretive, layered in caution, whispered conversations in back rooms, coded messages, meetings that shifted location at the last minute. He had built a network whose scale even he sometimes found hard to believe. Harlem had been his starting point, but now his contacts reached across boroughs, into neighboring states, and even into legitimate industries that provided cover for cash flow and transportation. The council had matured into a machine. Weekly meetings, rotating venues, written notes destroyed immediately after being read. Each man at the table had responsibilities and a share of the profits, and Nicky had created a rudimentary system of audits to make sure nobody skimmed more than their cut. The effect was almost corporate. People who had grown up around corner hustles now talked about inventory, logistics, and territories as if they were sales reps for a national brand. And at the top sat Nicky, not barking orders but facilitating strategy. He was at once the chairman, the motivator, and the final arbiter. He still found time for image building. Magazines wrote about Harlem nightlife and inevitably mentioned him. Club owners courted him to host events. Tailors knew his preferences and kept bolts of fabric aside just for him. He bought art for his apartment and learned the names of the artists, realizing that collecting could be both a pleasure and a way of signaling sophistication. Friends noticed a change in his conversation, less about street politics, more about culture, law, and finance. He was crafting a persona that could hold up under scrutiny. Yet for all the polish, he remained vigilant. He had seen too many men undone by their own reflection, believing the myth they'd created. "Don't confuse respect with invincibility," he told a young associate one night. "The first one you earn, the second one is a trap." He reminded the council constantly that law enforcement was adapting, that federal investigations were longer and more patient than ever. He hired accountants who could explain banking regulations, trying to stay ahead of new laws designed to track cash. He diversified income streams, mixing legitimate and illegitimate money in ways that made tracing difficult. It was a constant chess game. Community outreach remained part of his playbook. He donated anonymously to a youth center and arranged for an after-school music program. He turned up at funerals and weddings of local families, quietly paying for flowers or covering bills. This gave him goodwill that, while not erasing the nature of his business, complicated the way people thought of him. To some, he was a symbol of Harlem pride, someone who had made it and still remembered his roots. To others, he was simply another power broker using charm as a shield. Nicky accepted the contradiction. He understood that reputation was currency and kept spending it wisely. At the same time, he was expanding his circle of advisors, a lawyer to handle contracts, a real estate agent to scout properties, a discreet financial planner to discuss investments. These professionals were not always told the full picture, but they knew enough to keep things clean on paper. Nicky liked having multiple opinions before making decisions. He would sit at his kitchen table late at night, a pot of coffee nearby, listening to tapes of legal seminars or reading business books underlined in pencil. It was his way of staying sharp, of reminding himself that discipline wasn't just about secrecy, but about constant learning. Still, cracks began to appear. Some members of the council grew restless or careless. The pressure of handling large sums of money made tempers flare. Nicky found himself mediating disputes more often, reminding his partners of the code, sometimes replacing those who couldn't adapt. He knew the organization's strength depended on unity, and unity depended on trust. But trust, once frayed, was hard to repair. In private moments, he wondered if his system could survive its own success. Media attention intensified. A famous newspaper photographer caught him emerging from a courthouse after a minor civil matter. Not a criminal case, but enough to spark rumors. The image, published on page 1, showed him smiling faintly, immaculate as always. Some readers saw confidence, others saw arrogance. Nicky clipped that article too, placing it next to the earlier one in his folder. The contrast was striking. In one, he was called an entrepreneur. In the other, a suspected kingpin. He kept the clippings as a reminder of how quickly narratives could change. As Harlem shifted culturally and economically, Nicky tried to anticipate the next chapter. Urban renewal projects were changing neighborhoods. New faces were moving in. The music scene was evolving. He sensed that the environment that had allowed him to rise was also transforming. In long, late-night conversations with a few trusted confidants, he began to muse about an exit strategy. Could he turn fully legitimate? Could he hand off the council and walk away? Was it even possible to unwind an empire without a backlash? These were not idle questions. They were the worries of a man who understood cycles of power. Even as he considered these questions, he maintained his ritual of discipline. Cars rotated, numbers changed, meetings held under code names. He spent more time with his daughters, reading to them at night, hoping they would grow up far from the life that had defined him. He enrolled in a night class under an alias, studying business law. It was a quiet, almost private rebellion against the stereotype he'd been cast into. Looking back at the path he had walked, Nicky sometimes felt a flicker of pride and a shadow of unease. Pride because he had taken control of his circumstances and built something unprecedented. Unease because he knew how fragile it all was, how one wiretap, one informant, one misstep could unravel years of careful planning. He would stand at his apartment window in the early hours looking down at the streetlights glowing on the wet pavement and think about the thin line between a legend and a cautionary tale. By the time the summer of 1976 rolled in, Nicky Barnes had reached a point very few from his background could even imagine. He wasn't just a figure on the Harlem streets anymore. He was a headline, a symbol, a whisper in law enforcement offices, and a point of fascination in cocktail party conversations downtown. He had built a reputation for running his world with cool precision. Yet as he moved deeper into that world, he felt the walls closing in. He could sense the invisible grid of surveillance tightening, even though there were no dramatic raids, no obvious signs. It was the way cars sometimes lingered, the sudden appearance of new faces at familiar corners, the odd questions filtering back through the grapevine. Publicly, he remained composed. He still attended gallery openings, still made donations to youth programs, still stopped to sign autographs for teenagers who viewed him as a local celebrity. He was photographed at a black-tie fundraiser for a hospital, shaking hands with an actor who had played a police detective on television. In the picture, they both laughed at the irony, and the caption in the Sunday supplement called Nicky Harlem's most recognizable businessman. But inside, he could feel the first tremors of a storm. The council had grown so large that its original tightness was hard to maintain. Where once there had been 7 men around a table, now there were dozens of lieutenants, couriers, accountants, and intermediaries. It was impossible to keep personal eyes on every transaction. Nicky responded by creating layers of supervision and rotating responsibilities. But he knew that more people meant more variables. And variables, in his experience, were where leaks began. He began to notice subtle changes in the way federal agents operated. Instead of quick busts, they were playing a longer game. Wiretaps, undercover agents, slow-building cases. His lawyer friends quietly warned him about new investigative tools and the changing mood in Washington. The government was under pressure to show results in the so-called war on drugs, and high-profile figures like Nicky made perfect targets. He could almost feel the shift in the air when he walked out of his building, the difference between curiosity and intent. Despite the tension, Nicky kept working on a long-term plan to transition more money into legitimate businesses. He bought stakes in restaurants, small import-export firms, and even a record label that specialized in local jazz and soul acts. He imagined a future where he could ease out of the underground world and live openly as an entrepreneur. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet and his daughters were asleep, he would sketch out ideas on yellow legal pads, a clothing line, a real estate development, a scholarship fund. He still believed, or wanted to believe, that a clean exit was possible. His inner circle noticed his shifting priorities. Some respected it, seeing it as a wise move. Others worried it was a distraction. A few suspected he was thinking about leaving them behind. Rumors began to circulate. Nothing concrete, just the unease that comes when power starts to feel unsettled. Nicky tried to address it directly at meetings, reminding everyone of the code, reaffirming his commitment, but he could see in their eyes that trust was no longer automatic. Success had brought wealth and influence, but also envy and suspicion. At the same time, the press took a keener interest. One glossy magazine began working on a feature about black capitalism in Harlem and asked to photograph him. He declined, but the story ran anyway, quoting unnamed sources about the man known as Mr. Untouchable. The nickname stuck, and though Nicky outwardly brushed it off, he privately hated it. "The more they call you untouchable," he muttered to a confidant, "the more they're trying to touch you." He tightened his routines even further. New cars, new numbers, no pattern of movement. He moved some meetings to hotel suites registered under other names, and he used couriers instead of phone calls for sensitive messages. But even as he did this, he sensed that invisibility was slipping away. Fame had a gravity of its own, pulling him into the public eye no matter how he tried to resist. On the street, people whispered when he passed. In boardrooms downtown, executives knew his name. In Washington, committees used him as an example, yet he still found solace in quiet rituals. Early mornings spent jogging before the city fully woke. Afternoons at the record label's studio, listening to test pressings with young artists who had never heard of the council. Evenings at home helping his daughters with homework. For brief moments, he could almost pretend he was simply a businessman riding the wave of Harlem's Renaissance. But the file folders in federal offices were growing thicker, and the men assigned to those cases were patient. They had learned to build cases not on spectacle but on details. Nicky's story at this point was like a novel turning toward its third act. The hero at his peak, the forces of conflict gathering, the first cracks in the foundation. He still had choices. He still had resources. But he also had momentum, and momentum is hard to steer once it builds. Standing by his window at night, watching the city lights flicker like a million watchful eyes, He understood that the game he had mastered was changing. He wondered if he could change quickly enough to stay ahead of it. Autumn settled over New York like a heavy velvet curtain, and Nicky Barnes felt the shift in the air. Harlem at dusk still pulsed with music, laughter, and the smell of food from corner kitchens. But behind the familiar rhythm, he sensed a different kind of energy, quieter, more watchful. Federal investigators had been running long, patient operations all over the city, and he could almost feel their presence now in the pauses of a phone line, the unmarked sedans parked a little too long at the end of a block, the new faces hanging around the courthouse. He had lived long enough in the underworld to recognize the slow tightening of a net. Inside, the council was beginning to mirror the outside world. Men who had once been like brothers now came to meetings guarded, watching one another. The larger the network grew, the harder it was to enforce discipline. Nicky still opened each gathering with his measured calm, laying out numbers, reminding everyone of the rules. No unnecessary violence, no public displays, no careless talk. But he could feel attention drifting. Some were dazzled by their own success, others frightened by it. He tried to shore up loyalty with bonuses and gestures of respect, but he knew loyalty bought with money was brittle. He poured more energy into his legitimate projects, hoping to create an escape hatch. The record label signed 2 promising singers. The trucking company landed a contract moving supplies for a city agency. A boutique he'd financed began appearing in fashion columns. On paper, he looked every inch a Harlem entrepreneur riding a wave of opportunity. Late at night, he sat at his kitchen table with ledgers and prospectuses, sketching out a future that might allow him to step off the treadmill. If I can just make it another year, he told himself, maybe I can hand it all off. But fame has its own gravity. The Mr. Untouchable nickname had become a media fixture, and even people he had never met began using it. Magazine profiles speculated about his lifestyle. Talk show hosts joked about him in monologues. What had begun as a kind of backhanded compliment now felt like a curse. Every time they print that name, he muttered to a friend, they're inviting somebody to prove it wrong. He tightened his routines again, rotating apartments, meeting contacts through intermediaries, even changing the way he dressed to appear less distinctive. Yet he knew that a public image, once established, is almost impossible to shed. Meanwhile, investigators were not only gathering evidence but cultivating informants. Nicky had built his organization on a code of silence, but he also knew human nature. Fear, greed, and resentment could turn anyone. He began to test his lieutenants quietly, changing small details in stories to see if they leaked, altering meeting times at the last minute. The results were mixed. Most held firm, but a few small leaks appeared, like hairline cracks in glass. He felt the first real chill of vulnerability. Despite the tension, there were moments when the old charisma returned. At a youth center benefit, he spoke briefly about self-discipline and hard work without mentioning his own activities. Teenagers applauded, not knowing the full story behind the man in the tailored suit. Walking out into the cool evening afterwards, he thought about how different his life could have been if mentors like that had been there for him when he was young. It was a fleeting, bittersweet thought. The city itself was changing too. Urban renewal projects pushed longtime residents out, new policing tactics appeared, and a different generation was coming of age. Nicky, once a symbol of Harlem's resilience, began to feel like an artifact from another era, even as he stood at the center of it. He spent more time with his daughters, reading to them, taking them to museums, trying to plant seeds for a future far removed from his own path. Those quiet domestic moments became his refuge from the swirling pressures outside. But the machinery of the law was grinding on. Federal agents compiled ledgers, traced cash, flipped minor players. They weren't in a hurry. They were building a narrative, patient as chess players. Nicky had always prided himself on being a move ahead, but now he wasn't sure what the board even looked like. Standing by his apartment window in the early hours, the city spread out below like a living circuit board of lights. He wondered which of those lights were already pointed back at him. This was the turning point he had feared and half expected. The empire he had built was still running, still profitable, still admired in some circles. But he knew from experience that empires don't crumble overnight. They crack slowly at first from within. The question wasn't whether pressure would come, but how he would respond when it did. In the silence of his study, a jazz record spinning softly in the background, he began to sketch out yet another plan, not for expansion this time, but for survival. Winter of 1977 crept in with a hard wind off the Hudson, and Nicky Barnes began to feel it in his bones. Not just the cold, but the pressure. Out on the streets, the neon still burned bright, and the clubs still pulsed with music. But behind the scenes, a slow, deliberate case was coming together. Agents who had been quietly sitting on wiretaps and tailing cars for years were now comparing notes, building charts, cross-referencing names. They were no longer just watching. They were preparing. Nicky's public life had never looked shinier. His record label had just released a single that climbed a regional chart. The youth center he funded expanded its programs and sent him a plaque of appreciation. Photographers still loved him in his perfectly tailored suits, and more than one magazine held his photo up as an emblem of Harlem hustle. But he could feel the double edge. "Every time they print my picture," he said to a confidant, "they give somebody a reason to study it." Inside the council, tension simmered. Success had made everyone rich, but it had also made some careless. Small lapses, an unlogged payment, a name spoken on a tapped line, started to show up like tiny fractures. Nicky responded with more rules, more layers of separation. He stopped attending certain meetings himself, sending trusted intermediaries instead. He even floated the idea of stepping back entirely, letting the others take day-to-day control while he focused on the legitimate businesses. Some welcomed the thought. Others saw it as a sign of weakness. He tried to shore up morale. At one gathering, he reminded them of the early days, the discipline that had built their success. He spoke not as a boss, but as a coach, urging patience and precision. The room listened, but he could feel how different it was now. The old sense of unity had frayed. Money had changed people. Fame had changed him. When the meeting broke up, he watched his partners leave one by one, each disappearing into the winter night, and wondered which of them might already be talking to the other side. The press, meanwhile, pushed harder. Reporters called his lawyer looking for comments. A major newspaper prepared a Sunday magazine feature built around the Mr. Untouchable moniker. Nicky refused an interview, but the article ran anyway, showing him in an old photo leaning against a sleek car. The piece painted him as a genius of organization, but hinted at federal investigations closing in. He read it twice, folded it, and placed it in his folder of clippings. He was saving them now not as trophies, but as warnings. Privately, he began to rehearse different exit scenarios. One involved transferring his assets into a web of legitimate fronts and quietly relocating. Another involved cutting ties with the council entirely and living off the legitimate income. Late at night, long after his daughters were asleep, he walked the apartment floor in his slippers, coffee cooling on the table, thinking through each possibility. Could he leave without creating a vacuum? Could he trust anyone enough to hand over control? And most pressing, was it already too late? Despite the stress, he kept up small rituals to stay grounded. He still jogged at dawn, still took his daughters to museums, still listened to jazz records as the city hummed outside. Those quiet hours were a kind of armor, a way to remember that there was a life beyond the constant calculations. He told himself that discipline had brought him this far and might yet see him through. But discipline can't change momentum, and momentum was carrying him into uncharted territory. By spring, rumors reached him that sealed indictments were being prepared. He couldn't confirm it, but the tone of street chatter had shifted. People spoke of federal grand juries. A few minor players vanished from the scene, either arrested or quietly flipping. Nicky doubled his security precautions, but he also felt a strange calm. "If it's coming, it's coming," he murmured one night, staring out the window at the city lights. "All I can do is be ready." In that moment, standing at the edge of his own legend, Nicky Barnes faced the paradox he had always understood. The same discipline that built his empire might be the only thing that could save him, or it might only delay the inevitable. The city outside kept moving, unaware of the private calculations happening high above the street. Down in Harlem, the music played on, but for Nicky, the soundtrack was quieter now, a steady drumbeat of decisions that would shape the next chapter of his life. Spring turned to a heavy New York summer, the kind where the air hung thick over 7th Avenue and tempers boiled just as easily as car engines. To the untrained eye, Harlem was still moving to its usual rhythm, storefront radios playing soul, kids running through open fire hydrants, late-night diners glowing like beacons. But to Nicky Barnes, every sound carried a second meaning now. Each ringing phone felt like a test. Each knock at the door could be routine, or the moment everything changed. By now, the federal case against him was no longer just whispers. Lawyers he knew began to hint that sealed indictments existed. An associate's cousin had been quietly subpoenaed. People started showing up in court records under John Doe pseudonyms. When Nicky's driver mentioned seeing a strange car parked across from his apartment 3 nights running, Nicky only nodded. "They're showing their hand," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean they've played their last card." He tried to stay disciplined. His meetings moved to different locations every week: a back booth of a quiet seafood restaurant in Queens, a borrowed office in the Bronx, even a suite rented under a false name in Midtown. He used payphones instead of his office line, scribbling numbers on slips of paper and burning them after use. He pushed more responsibility onto his intermediaries, telling them, "It's your show now. Keep it clean." He'd always prided himself on being 2 steps ahead, and for a while it felt like he was still dancing between the raindrops. But pressure changes people. Some of the council's younger members began to argue over money, accusing one another of cutting side deals. One man disappeared for 2 weeks and came back with a story about being out of town, but Nicky noticed his eyes shifting and his hands shaking. Another quietly moved his family to another state. A third asked to retire, a word no one had used before. Trust, the invisible glue that had held everything together, was starting to dissolve. Even Nicky's public image was double-edged now. The Mr. Untouchable nickname, which once seemed like a crown, had become a target. When a glossy magazine ran another feature about him, complete with an old photo of him in a velvet jacket, he slammed it shut halfway through. "They're writing my opening statement for the prosecutor," he muttered to his lawyer. He instructed his staff to stop all publicity, cancel appearances, and quietly close 2 of the businesses most likely to draw scrutiny. At home, he tried to keep life normal for his daughters. He still helped with homework, still took them to Central Park, still played records on Saturday mornings. But they could sense the tension. One night, his youngest asked, "Daddy, why are there men in cars outside?" He smiled and said they were just people keeping an eye on things, but inside he felt the sting. The life he'd built to protect his family was now exposing them. By late summer, the signs were unmistakable. A longtime courier was arrested on a minor charge and released suspiciously fast. A lawyer friend told Nicky off the record that a grand jury had been impaneled specifically to look into his activities. Another contact hinted that informants were already inside the circle. Nicky sat in his office one night, a single lamp on, stacks of files around him, and whispered to himself, "I built it like a fortress, but I never built a way out." Yet even under that cloud, he maintained a strange composure. He doubled down on legitimate ventures, quietly transferring assets, paying off debts, and creating a paper trail of above-board income. He stopped attending certain private parties. He began keeping a small overnight bag ready in case he needed to leave on short notice. When an associate asked if he was scared, he said, "I'm not scared, I'm awake." The city outside kept moving. Trains rumbled, clubs filled, block parties spilled onto sidewalks. But for Nicky, the noise felt muted now, like hearing music through a wall. Each day was a balancing act: maintain appearances, tighten defenses, and prepare for a future he could no longer fully predict. In quieter moments, when the phone stopped ringing and the night was still, he would stand by the window looking out over Harlem, remembering the boy who had once dreamed of control and wondering if the time had come to let go. As summer faded, his world felt like a chessboard late in the game. Pieces still on the board, but options narrowing. The next moves would determine everything. For the first time, Nicky Barnes, Mr. Untouchable, could feel the touch of the net tightening, invisible but undeniable. The fall air in New York had changed. Gone was the lazy, heavy heat of summer. Now there was a crispness, a kind of metallic edge in the wind that slid through Harlem's brownstone streets. For Nicky Barnes, the change felt like an omen. He had always been sensitive to shifts, weather, moods, markets. This time, though, it wasn't just a seasonal breeze. It was the smell of an approaching storm. One October morning, Nicky's lawyer called him before dawn. "They're moving," he said. "Indictments will be unsealed any day now." The words hung in the dark like smoke. Nicky thanked him calmly, hung up, and sat on the edge of his bed listening to the city waking up below. Garbage trucks clanked, a radio played a soul ballad, and somewhere a child laughed. Ordinary sounds, yet everything felt suddenly fragile, like glass about to crack. He dressed as if nothing had changed, silk tie, tailored suit, and went to one of his small offices. Inside, his inner circle had already gathered. Faces he had known for years looked back at him, some tight with worry, others blank, a few already drifting toward the door mentally. He spoke slowly, his voice even. "We've been preparing for this. Stick to the plan. Don't improvise. Keep business clean." They nodded, but Nicky could feel the space between them widening. Loyalty was easy when money flowed and risk felt distant. It was another thing entirely when federal agents were knocking at doors. By midweek, subpoenas arrived like a drumbeat. A cousin of one council member was called to testify. Another's girlfriend was interviewed. Anonymous leaks appeared in the papers hinting at a major Harlem case that would rock the city. Nicky clipped each article, read it in silence, and placed it in a folder. "They're building a narrative," he told his lawyer, "and I'm the headline." He tightened his routines. Meetings were shorter, travel was limited, conversations coded. But paranoia has a way of creeping in. Once, while riding uptown, Nicky spotted a familiar face sitting at the back of the bus, a man who had been at his club months ago. Was he a federal watcher, a reporter, or just a coincidence? Another night he returned to his apartment to find a window slightly open, though he was sure he had locked it. Little details became question marks. Even the walls seemed to listen. Yet he still carried himself with composure in public. When reporters shouted questions at him outside the courthouse steps after a brief appearance for a minor charge, he smiled politely and said, "No comment." In the same week, he attended his daughter's school recital, sitting quietly in the back, clapping with the other parents. The double life, the man under siege and the father in the audience, grew heavier, but he bore it with the same careful poise that had built his reputation. Behind closed doors, though, he was planning contingencies. He began transferring ownership of legitimate businesses to trusted associates. He gave instructions for funds to be moved offshore through legal channels. He even considered leaving the country entirely. One night he confided to his lawyer, "I always said I'd never run, but what if running is the smartest move?" The lawyer didn't answer. As November rolled in, the government made its move. Early morning raids hit several properties connected to his organization. Men were taken in handcuffs, boxes of papers seized, bank accounts frozen. News crews filmed the whole thing. For the first time in years, Nicky's name appeared on television, not as a whisper, but in bold captions. "Mr. Untouchable faces federal charges," one anchor intoned. Watching from his apartment, Nicky exhaled slowly. "So it begins," he said. The indictment was sweeping. It listed dozens of counts: racketeering, tax evasion, conspiracy, without a single violent accusation but enough paper violations to build a mountain. The prosecutors smiled for cameras, promising to end an era. Nicky's lawyers filed motions, challenged evidence, and spoke of overreach and publicity stunts. But the momentum was against them. In the court of public opinion, the case was already half won. Still, Nicky went about his days with discipline. He appeared in court immaculately dressed, greeting his attorneys politely, nodding at reporters without answering. Inside, he studied the prosecutors, the jurors, the judge, reading their body language like cards in a deck. "They want a story," he whispered once to his counsel. "Let's see if they can prove it." But the greater danger wasn't only the prosecutors, it was within. Under pressure, associates began to splinter. Some gave small statements in exchange for leniency. Others simply disappeared. A few tried to reinvent themselves as legitimate businessmen overnight, distancing themselves from Nicky as though they had never known him. One evening, he sat alone in a quiet bar, staring at a photograph of his inner circle taken 5 years before. Almost all of them had been in that room with him last month, but now it felt like looking at ghosts. His nights grew longer. Sometimes he would walk the city streets alone, hat pulled low, watching the lights in apartment windows, the swirl of steam from manholes, the endless movement of a city that always outlived its kings. He thought about his rise, the deals, the discipline, the carefully crafted image, and how in the end the very legend of Mr. Untouchable had drawn the spotlight that now burned him. Yet even as the walls closed in, there was a flicker of resolve. In quiet moments he told himself, "I'll decide how this ends, not them." He thought about his daughters, about the neighborhood, about the boy he once was. Perhaps, he mused, the story of Nicky Barnes was never about invincibility, but about how one man faced the moment when invincibility ended. As the year turned toward winter, court dates loomed and the newspapers speculated. "Sources say Barnes may consider cooperating," one headline read. He folded the paper and set it aside. The decision of what to do next, fight, flee, or something unthinkable, hung over him like the winter sky. The stage was set for a reckoning that would define not just his fate, but his legacy. Winter in New York has a way of stripping everything down to its bones. Trees stand bare, wind sweeps along the avenues, and even the busiest corners seem quieter under a gray sky. For Nicky Barnes, those months felt like the world itself had slowed to watch what would happen next. The prosecutors had unveiled their case. The headlines had been written. What remained was his choice, and how he would live with it. Day after day, he walked into the courthouse, his breath visible in the cold morning air, cameras clicking as he passed. He no longer read the tabloids that speculated about his fate. Instead, he focused on details. The texture of the wooden rail at the defense table, the way jurors exchanged glances, the steady voice of the judge reading out motions. Each day felt like a chess move, and he was weighing not only the next move but the entire board. His lawyers urged him to fight. "We can challenge the evidence, drag this out, maybe get a mistrial," one said. Another whispered, "They don't have you on anything violent. We can work with that." But Nicky knew the deeper truth. The case was built not just on paper but on people, witnesses, insiders, men he had once trusted. In private, he told his attorney, "The foundation cracked. You can't patch a cracked foundation by repainting the walls." At night, he sat in his apartment, lights low, a record spinning softly. He thought about the boy he'd been, shining shoes on Lenox Avenue, dreaming of control, of respect. He thought about the long climb, the discipline, the reputation as Mr. Untouchable. He thought about the daughters who deserved a father more than they deserved a myth. And he thought about freedom, not the freedom of power, but the freedom of telling the truth and walking away. Slowly, a decision took shape. If the government had built its case on stories, he would tell his own. If loyalty had already been broken, he would stop pretending it existed. "They call me untouchable," he murmured to his reflection one night. "Maybe the bravest thing is to stop trying to be." The next morning he called his lawyer and said simply, "Set up the meeting." The shift was almost imperceptible at first. He continued to appear in court, continued to dress immaculately, continued to speak politely to reporters. But behind closed doors, in sealed rooms with federal agents and prosecutors, Nicky began to speak. He recounted names, dates, deals, not to glorify them, but to draw a line under them. Each session felt like peeling back layers of his own story, exposing not only the organization but his own role within it. It wasn't an easy decision, and it wasn't made lightly. But in his mind, it was a pivot, a way to reclaim some measure of control over a life that had spun into spectacle. News of his cooperation didn't break immediately. For a time, only a small circle knew. He still walked the streets, still attended his daughter's school events, still sat quietly at night listening to music. But he felt the change inside himself, a mixture of relief, sadness, and an unfamiliar kind of honesty. For years he had built walls. Now, brick by brick, he was dismantling them. When the story finally hit the press, Mr. Untouchable turns government witness, the shock was electric. Commentators called it the end of an era. Associates reacted with disbelief, anger, or silence. Some vanished overnight. But Nicky himself did not give interviews or issue statements. He simply kept his head down and continued, cooperating, knowing that every word he spoke in those sealed rooms was another step away from the man he had been. Through it all, he tried to anchor himself in small, human moments, helping his daughters with their homework, watching the snow fall outside his